A reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verses 20 through 30. And you can find this reading on page 912 in the Pew Bible. Then he went home, and the crowd came together again so that they... That isn't it. Then he went home, and the crowd came together again so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons." And he called them to him, and he spoke to them in parables. "How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly, I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter, but whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin, for they had said, 'He has an unclean spirit.'" The Gospel of the Lord.
So graduating seniors, some are here, many have other obligations, as you can imagine, in our busy schedules. But I'd like to at least lift up maybe memories for all of us, because we've all left home, unless, of course, you're roughly 18 or under. But those of us who are adults, we have left home at some time, whether it was to go to college, or maybe it was to your first job or your first apartment, whatever that happened to be for you, we've all been there. We've all had that rite of passage. And so thinking about and realizing this is our graduation celebration, our graduation Sunday, of course, it shot me back to memories of that experience for myself. Next slide, please. This is where I went to college, one of our ELCA schools, a liberal arts college in Moorhead, Minnesota, named Concordia College. I can't express enough how many fond, not just fond memories, incredible memories, life-changing memories of just shaping who I am, making me the person I am, knowing my place in the world, helping me see the world in a bigger way, meeting my wife. I mean, so many things for me happened while I was here at Concordia College. Next slide, please. This is my first day. Yeah, you keep laughing. I'll get your picture someday, too, I tell you. It's my roommate, Todd Martinson, on the left, on your right. This is the first day we met. Literally the first day we hauled our stuff in. You can see behind me on our left is a green TV. This is back when rarely did we get TVs in our own rooms. I had that since I was a sophomore in high school, right? The old dial TV. Beautiful thing, right? And then if my memory serves, it's been a while, but I think what it's sitting on is something called a VCR. That's right. Which meant, because I had a TV and VCR, I was the cool kid in the room, right? On the whole floor, that's where it all happened. Tons of memories of that day, of that moment, of those relationships just forming, stepping off into really a new life, right? An independent life. Concordia College is in Moorhead, Minnesota. As I said, Moorhead shares a river border with Fargo, North Dakota. And in that community, there are 3 schools. On the North Dakota side, there's North Dakota State University, pretty big school. And on the Minnesota side is Concordia College, a small liberal arts school, and then its arch nemesis, Moorhead State University, I think now known as University of Minnesota at Moorhead. There are plenty of jokes that go along with the state school kids and the liberal arts school kids, as you could probably make up all on your own. But for Concordia, you had to, as a freshman, as a new student, everybody had to wear a beanie until the football team scored its first score. Field goal, touchdown, whatever it happened to be. And we all had to wear these around campus. And, of course, all of the upperclassmen would make fun of us. You don't get to. But we would wear these, and that would be kind of our rite of passage as freshmen at this school. On the flip side, those Morehead State students, as freshmen, they got rewarded if they could steal one of these beanies from those liberal arts kids over there at Concordia. And so they would pay these 12-year-old kids to ride through campus on their bikes and snatch them off of our heads, right? So you can just imagine these kids zipping through campus, reaching out, grabbing these things off the top of our head. So what did I do? I bought a bunch of thumbtacks and put them upside down in my hat. I'm not proud of it. Just telling you what I did, right? And I put them upside down in my hat, and they'd come by, and they'd, thumbtack in the hand, and they'd fall over, and I'd say, good for you, 12-year-old kid. Hey. We've all done things we're not proud of, right? But we also would do other things with these beanies. Next slide, please. This is the mascot. The Morehead State University mascot was dragon. So they were the dragons, right? And so they had this really cool statue of a two-headed dragon in their courtyard, and you could see the two heads, and it was connected to natural gas, and so it would puff gas every 15 or fire every 15 or 20 minutes. It was actually pretty neat, to be honest. One more slide, please. But you can see it's pretty tall, and so we would make middle-of-the-night trips, and by middle of the night, I mean 3 or 4 in the morning, right, which is just when the night's getting good. And we would scale this thing, and we would make sure that we put a beanie on the top of that thing. So when those Morehead State kids would wake up, they would know who owned them. You know what I mean? But we would also, if you've ever seen those arrows, like Steve Martin used to wear in SNL, and they'd put them on your head and look like the arrow was going through your head, we would make swords like that and put it through the body of the dragon. And we would put the beanie on, and they could tell that we'd slayed their dragon overnight. It was awesome, right? So, as you're graduating, as you go off to wherever you're going, I just want to point out, don't do what I did, but you can have a lot of fun. That's one of the things we did. Here's another. Next slide, please. Anyone do this? So back in the day, I don't know how college was like for some of you, or maybe your first job. When I was in college, almost nobody had a car. But there was always one in every group, right? Some kid who had some old beat-up car that we would all try to pile in, because that was the only way we would get anywhere. So if you had a car that seated 5, that meant 10 college students would fit, right? And there was this one kid, and I don't really remember his name very well, if at all. I remember his nickname, though. He was a small kid on our floor, and we nicknamed him Rat Boy, because he had the face of a rat. He was a good guy, but he just had this, scrunched up little face. He was a tiny kid, and so that meant he got to go into the trunk. Hey, he was willing. So we would. I remember one specific time where we put him in the trunk, and we were driving to wherever we were going, hitting some turns, and college students, we drive very safe and slow. So I'm sure it was comfortable, but we heard him kicking in the trunk, right? Boom, 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 boom. And so we pulled over, like, what's going on with Rat Boy, right? What's happening? And we open the trunk, and we see him with his hand on his face, and he takes his hand off, and his tooth is chipped. The driver, the owner of the car, had a bowling ball back there. Welcome to college, right? Those are stories that are, of course, kind of funny and bring back memories for some of us. But I don't want to kid you either. There are plenty of stories that simply aren't appropriate for me to tell here. No kidding, Pastor Rob. But there are also stories I'm ashamed of. As I'm sure many of you, as you look back at any point in your life, but specifically those first years when you first left home, you probably made decisions and had done things that you'll never share in public. Probably have plenty of stories that you're ashamed of. I do too. Next slide, please. Today's text comes from the Gospel of Mark. As you know, I often prefer to preach in sermon series, right? Have a book of the Bible that we go through or something like that. Very rarely do I preach out of the lectionary, which are the prescribed readings for groups of churches that we can all make sure we're following, things like that. And there's pros and cons, right? Sometimes if you follow the lectionary, you're bouncing all over the place and there's no real logical flow. On the flip side, the good thing about a lectionary is that it forces you to preach and talk and think and pray about texts that you would more prefer to ignore. You're forced to. You have to deal with some of the tough issues. And to be honest, I had decided to more or less preach through the lectionary this summer so that I could plan for next fall and start thinking about different sermon series. And so here we are, I'm planning on the lectionary. We have graduation Sunday, and we have this text that talks about unforgivable sin. This text that talks about blasphemy against the Spirit. This text that challenges Lutheran theology more than any other, a theology that says we are saved by grace, a theology that says that the parameters of grace have to be at least as wide as the parameters of sin. Theology that says everything is forgiven. And yet there's this text that says maybe not everything. I would have preferred to ignore this text today. Here we are. So we're going to dive into this just a little bit. We're going to give you some ideas, or at least one idea, and take you down hopefully a short road, right? A short road of giving you what I think might be one way to look at this particular text. We're not gonna shy away from it. I actually texted Keith Miller, who's preaching at another church, and he's the one. He's also preaching on this text, but he's ignoring the whole blasphemy against the Spirit. So I texted him and said, "You're a chicken." So, so my point is that it is easier, and sometimes it's not a bad idea to kind of take other parts of this text. But I want us today, especially in light of so many young people taking a new step in their lives, to maybe tackle some of the tough stuff. Because let's face it, when you leave your parents' house for the first time, you are about to tackle some of the tough stuff. So, next slide, please. When we look at the Gospel of Mark, there is a typo on here, so you don't need to tell me later if you find it. There is a lot of scholarship on how to read the Gospel of Mark. And although I'm sure this is riveting reading for you, there is a dissertation series on what is seriously called the Markan sandwich. And that sounds a little goofy for scholarship, but it's called the Markan sandwich because many instances in the book of Mark, the author uses this technique to get an idea across. And sometimes I think you have to at least see the possibility of this writing technique to maybe get at the heart of whatever that passage is trying to say to us. And this particular passage, blasphemy against the Spirit, unforgivable sin, does actually fall into this category of a Markan sandwich. And this is what it looks like. Next slide. So this text for today, you see there are three parts. And we're actually going a little bit beyond what we read. So Mark chapter 3, verses 20 through 22, what we see is Jesus being criticized by everybody around him. Jesus being criticized first by his family, his mom and his brothers, and they're basically saying, "You're crazy." In the literal Greek, it says that he is beside himself. Said another way, and that the translation we heard says the same thing, that he is out of his mind. Right? It's kind of like that person who you don't agree with and people are talking about, and they're, "Oh yeah, my brother, yeah, he's crazy, ignore him," right? We've all been there, and we know what that's all about. Ignore that person, they're out of their mind. That's what his family is doing to him. But even beyond that, it's the Pharisees, the teachers of the law are saying the same thing. They're saying literally, and I'll read this again for you, literally they are saying that the teachers of law who came down from Jerusalem, he is possessed by Beelzebub, he is possessed by the prince of demons. So they're not just saying he's crazy, they're saying, "Oh, he's possessed. He's full of Beelzebub. He don't even listen to him." Everybody is separating themselves from Jesus. And then he drops in this parable. He drops in this parable in verses 23 through 30. This parable about a house divided against itself cannot stand. This parable that talks about what it is to separate yourself from one another. And then this is where the whole mind loop comes in. Because Just listen to this. If you didn't hear it, I want to read this very carefully and clearly. It starts in verse 28. I tell you the truth. Jesus is speaking at the tail end of this parable. I tell you the truth. All the sins and blasphemies of people will be forgiven. All the sins and blasphemies of people will be forgiven. All. Next line. Next line is this. It is, but whoever blasphemes the Spirit will not be forgiven. So what is it? Are all sins and blasphemies forgiven? Or is there something that's not forgiven? It's both there. It's right there in the text. You have to choose which one you want to throw out and deal with that, because it says both. In one breath, he says all sins and blasphemies are forgiven. In the next, he says there is one that isn't. Which one is it? And that's what kind of forces us to spin in our theology and our belief. What is Jesus saying? This doesn't make any sense. If you can go back to the previous slide, please. And then there is the last part, thank you, of this sandwich is Mark chapter 3, and really verses 31 to 35, where Jesus talks about who is actually his family. And he says, anyone who does the will of God is part of the family, is part of his mom and his brothers, everybody that's in. So what you have is this sandwich, so to speak, being taught of, at the beginning and the end, you see something about people who are separating themselves from Jesus by using their words, by criticizing, by making sure, he doesn't speak for me, he's crazy, he's possessed. And then Jesus says, but whoever does the will of God is actually part of this, part of my family, part of the circle. And Jesus speaks in the middle of that all about what it means to be separated, division, divisiveness. A house divided cannot stand. So the real question is this: what is blasphemy? What is it? And what's at stake? I mean, a lot of us are afraid, at least I am. I'm less concerned immediately about what it is to blaspheme. I want to know what's at stake. If I do something, what's happening? What's at stake? Am I not forgiven? It says I'm not forgiven. What does that mean? And a lot of us jump to, well, I must be going to hell. Blaspheme against the Spirit. I don't know what it is, but I want to do it because I might be going to hell. Next slide, please. Part of our church, actually about 60 people this summer, are doing this book study, Love Wins. If you still want to jump in, you can. We're starting the first chapter this week. But our very first evening, this last Wednesday, we kind of prefaced things, we kind of set the stage, and I asked everybody to describe their definition of hell. What does hell mean to you based on your church background, how you were raised, what books you read, whatever, right? No right or wrong answer. But across the board, the by far the largest description of hell wasn't a fiery lake or a burning hot place. It was separation from God. Hell is the separation from God. A pretty good Lutheran answer, that the definition of hell is the separation from God. I wonder if this blasphemy against the Spirit has nothing to do with the checklists of right or wrongs. What is the one thing I'm not supposed to do? What is the sin I'm supposed to stay away from? What is it I'm not supposed to do against the Spirit? I wonder if blasphemy itself is the separation from God. Meaning that when you separate yourself, when you criticize, when you separate for yourself from God, you are not able to see God present and working in your life. It is a fact. I believe it is a fact that we are all forgiven. All of us. That's the work of the cross. It's not good news unless we get it even if we don't deserve it. We are forgiven. But there may be a difference between what is real in eternity and what we actually experience right now. I believe what is real in the work of Jesus is that we are all forgiven and nothing is unforgivable. But I also believe that we can experience hell on earth when we don't experience God in our lives. If we don't let God or see God working in our everyday lives, then we'll never experience forgiveness. we will only experience separation. You see, we all have something from our past that we're ashamed of. We all have that story or stories that we'll never speak in public. And sometimes the weight of that guilt or that shame feels like a personal hell. Because that is space that we have separated God out of. We have not let God into that space. We have not let God wash his forgiving presence over it. We are forgiven for it. But if we don't experience God in that space, then we'll never experience God's forgiveness. Next slide. See, Jesus is talking about community. He's talking about criticizing and drawing lines and saying things that separate us from other people, from the Christian community. He says at the end of that Markan sandwich, the second slice, if you will, of that piece, is he's saying everybody is in who does the will of God. College student or high school students, as you graduate, go off to college or whatever it is that you're doing. Unfortunately, to tell you the truth, you will have plenty of shame over the next 60 years. When you leave your family's house, you will do things, you will see things, you will be a part of things that will make you feel some sort of separation from God. Like Jesus says, I encourage you not to separate yourself from your family, from God's people, from the Christian community, and God's self. When you do that, you'll never experience the forgiveness that is already given you. When you go off to college or your first job, don't think that that is your one opportunity to sleep in necessarily on Sunday morning, although I did all the time, so I shouldn't talk. I'm not talking about worship in Sunday morning church. I'm talking about the community that reminds each and every one of us every single day of the forgiveness that comes in Christ. When you leave your family's house, it's a fun time. And maybe you'll meet your own rat boy, or maybe you'll have your own beanies and your own traditions, and you'll slay your own dragons. But don't separate God from that experience. Because if you do that, you will know a type of hell. God isn't just about being perfect. In fact, God isn't about being perfect at all. God is God of all things. Don't exclude God from anything. Let us pray. Creator God, we thank you for being a God of big things, a God that challenges us, a God that stretches us, a God that pushes us past our own limitations. Thank you for being a God that forgives us even if we don't think we are forgiven. For being a God of grace, the kind of grace that is much bigger and broader than any sin. Help us, though, God, invite you into our space, into our lives, the good and the bad. Give us the courage to invite you in. Give us the will to have you wash over all things, the fun things, the funny things, the joyful things. But more importantly, help us invite you in to the painful things, the shameful things. Because only in your presence in this world can we truly experience the grace that you have already most definitely given us in your Son. Help us not just be forgiven, but know it. In your name we pray. Amen.